Hallo Deutschlerner! You know a lot about how to use the Konjunktiv 2 in German to express things that are contrary to reality. You know that you can use werden with most verbs to express the present or future tenses in sentences like Ich würde diesen Kanal abonnieren. You can also use forms of the verbs haben and sein and their Konjunktiv 2 version either on their own in the present tense or with a past participle in the past tense using sentences like Ich hätte mehr Geld, wenn ich Deutsch gelernt hätte. Or, ich wäre glücklicher, wenn ich im Deutschunterricht geblieben wäre. If you don't know those things already, watch my videos on those topics first, link in the description. In this lesson, you will learn how and why to use modal verbs in the Konjunktiv 2. Grab a notebook and a pen and let's get started. For a quick refresher, modal verbs are verbs that change the way that the main verb acts within a sentence. There is probably a way more complicated way to explain this, but that's the general idea. You can go from a sentence like Ich gehe ins Kino to Ich will ins Kino gehen. There is a huge difference between those two sentences because going to the movies and wanting to go to the movies is entirely different. While both sentences use gehen as the main verb, the modal verb wollen changes the sentence entirely. Modal verbs in German include mögen, müssen, dürfen, können, sollen, and wollen. You're likely already familiar with the Konjunktiv 2 version of mögen, as it's often used in polite requests and usually is taught alongside all of the other modal verbs as if it were its own verb. That form is möchten. In order to create this verb, we took the original forms of the verb mögen in the Präteritum tense and added umlauts to every form. Ich mag becomes ich mochte in the past, and ich möchte in the Konjunktiv 2. The rest of the Konjunktiv 2 forms of mögen are as follows. Ich möchte, du möchtest, sie es möchte, wir möchten, ihr möchtet, sie möchten. Since you're probably already familiar with this form of mögen, I'm not going to dwell on that any further. It is a great way to think about the other forms of the modal verbs, however. Start with the Präteritum form of the verb. Müssen becomes musste, dürfen, durfte, können, konnte, sollen, sollte, wollen, wollte. Then add an umlaut to everything except sollen and wollen. I'll explain why in a bit. Ich müsste, du müsstest, sie es müsste, wir müssten, sie müssten. Ich dürfte, du dürftest, sie es dürfte, wir dürften, ihr dürftet, sie dürften. Ich könnte, du könntest, sie es könnte, wir könnten, ihr könntet, sie könnten. Ich sollte, du solltest, sie es sollte, wir sollten, ihr solltet, sie sollten. Ich wollte, du wolltest, sie es wollte, wir wollten, ihr wolltet, sie wollten. I said I would explain why sollen and wollen don't get umlauts for the Konjunktiv 2. First of all, it just sounds clunky and weird, so ich wollte, sollte, it doesn't exactly slide off the tongue. The second reason is because wollen is never going to be used like this. The only time that contrary to reality wanting can happen is when you're talking about the deceased. For example, mein Vater würde wohl wollen, dass ich ein Motorrad kaufe. My father would probably have wanted me to buy a motorcycle. Notice that I used würde instead of using wollte, and that's because it would be ambiguous. It could have been interpreted as your father told you before he died that you should buy a motorcycle, but that isn't what I'm trying to express here. There is no explicit knowledge of his wishes with regards to your purchasing a motorcycle before his passing. We are purely guessing here. The bottom line is that you're going to find better ways to express whatever you might have wanted to say using wollen in the Konjunktiv 2. It just isn't used. Sollen goes down a different path. The Konjunktiv 2 has long been associated with polite requests. It is exactly what sollen does in the Konjunktiv 2. You can tell someone what they should do. This looks exactly like the past tense, but context is king here. It allows us to readily recognize the difference between past and Konjunktiv 2. There's also a bit of a who cares factor involved with sollen in the Konjunktiv 2. In the end, does it matter if you're saying he shouldn't go or he shouldn't have gone? Not really. Here are a few examples. Sollten wir nach Hause fahren? Should we have driven home? Should we drive home? In each of these sentences, no one cares which one it is. Either the action is already done and over with and you drove home and you are now questioning the decision that you just made, or you have not yet decided whether you're leaving and you are contemplating the idea of driving home. Context will tell you which one is meant, but the grammar does not matter here, because the end result is the same. There is a third context that could be meant here. It could be a past recommended request. Were we requested to drive home while not yet home? Solltet ihr eure Mutter fragen? Were you supposed to ask your mother? Should you ask your mother? This one is even more on the nose. If you assume that it is in the past tense, were you supposed to ask your mother, the implication is that you should ask your mother. If you assume the Konjunktiv 2, should you ask your mother, it is explicitly telling you to ask your mother. Either way, it is when you hear the German sentence, you would probably go ask your mother. So, we have crossed off mögen, wollen, and sollen off of our list. Let's see how we can use the other modal verbs in the Konjunktiv 2. Was wäre, wenn ich hier arbeiten wollte? Was müsste ich tun? What would happen if I wanted to work here? What would I have to do? Sie müssten dieses Formular ausfüllen. You would have to fill out this form. Why not just use müssen in this context? I assume that the context of this sentence required the Konjunktiv 2. The customer is asking what it would take for them to apply for the job. They didn't say they actually wanted to apply for the job. They simply asked what it might be if they were to apply for the job. This is all being expressed in the Konjunktiv 2, so it's only natural that you would use the Konjunktiv 2 when answering the question as well. Basically, it would be natural to continue the conversation in the Konjunktiv 2 because the premise was presented by the customer in the Konjunktiv 2. Ich dürfte kein Eis essen, wenn ich laktoseintolerant wäre. I wouldn't be allowed to eat ice cream if I were lactose intolerant. Dürftest du mit mir ins Kino gehen, wenn ich deinen Vater fragen würde? Would you be allowed to go to the movies with me if I asked your father? When you use können in the Konjunktiv 2, it is most likely to request something in German. For example, könnten Sie mir bitte zeigen, wo der Bahnhof ist? Could you please show me where the train station is? Könntest du die Tür bitte zumachen? Could you please close the door? You can use this verb, however, in the normal Konjunktiv 2 ways. For example, könnte schneller fahren, wenn einen Audi gekauft hätte. He could drive faster if he would have bought an Audi. Wir könnten nach dem Film ins Restaurant gehen. We could go to the restaurant after the film. The main thing that you need to take away from all of this is that you conjugate the modal verbs in the forms that I gave you earlier and put the other verb at the end of the sentence or clause like you would in any other time that you use a modal verb. There is one small caveat that you should be aware of, however. To talk about what someone could have done or would have been allowed to do in the past tense, you need a different construction. It's called a double infinitive, and it does exactly what you're thinking it does. You use the Konjunktiv 2 forms of haben plus the infinitive forms of the main verb and the modal verb. For example, du hättest ins Kino gehen dürfen, wenn du dein Zimmer aufgeräumt hättest. You would have been allowed to go to the movies if you would have cleaned your room. Hätte den Boden trocknen können, wenn es ein sauberes Tuch irgendwo im Haus gäbe. He could have dried off the floor if there were a clean towel anywhere in the house. I know what you're thinking. Where did gäbe come from? Well, that is one of the verbs that is commonly used in their official Konjunktiv 2 forms. No würde anywhere in sight. If you would like to understand how to do that, click over here for my video about that, and I'll see you over there. Tschüss!